Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of The Boardroom, where, as always, we're talking to business leaders in Malta to try to understand the trends and what's going to come next for the Maltese economy. Today, we're going to be talking about how to unlock digital potential. And we're doing that because last week, the Malta Communications Authority had a conference to celebrate 20 years of regulation in Malta with a mix of local and international speakers and a variety of very interesting topics discussed. It was a fantastic and varied event with topics including how to deliver value for all in a digital world, panels on leveraging digital opportunities, and a talk on safeguarding against threats. Now, today, I'm pleased to welcome three guests to help us learn more about how to unlock digital value for our society, all of them from the Malta Communications Authority. And they are Joseph Seychell, who is the Senior Manager for Information Management and Technologies at the MCA, Bernard Agius, who's the Manager for eCommerce Policy and Initiatives, and Robert Mifsud, who is the Senior Management Team External Relations Function of the Authority. Good morning, gentlemen. Great to have you with me today. Thanks for being with us on the Boardroom.
Good morning.
Good. So, Robert, I'm going to come to you first. Let's launch straight in and learn a little bit more about the Malta Communications Authority, the MCA. So it was set up an incredible 20 years ago now to regulate communications in Malta. So perhaps you can briefly explain to us the role of the MCA and how it evolved over time.
Good morning. Thank you for this question. Let me take you back 20 years, 2001. The year, it's quite a long time, the year when Pope John II visited Malta for his second time. It was a time we're dealing, the Malta Communication Authority deals with communication technologies. It's a time when we used to, an average user would used to have a Pentium 2 computer, which is almost unheard of by the new generation today. We used to connect to the internet via a 56K modem. We used to connect normally after 6 o'clock in the evening with a dial-up connection because telephone calls used to make use of telephone technology to connect were very expensive. And at that time, it was just one pulse. And the lucky few that had a mobile and had some kind of mobile internet used to see a screen which was a stamp-sized screen with some monochrome text to access the internet. So that is how far we've moved in the past 20 years in terms of technology. The authority was set up to regulate the electronic communications market. It was a requirement under EU rules at a time when these markets were mainly of a monopolistic nature, with governments having, within Europe, having direct interest and running companies, telecommunication companies in the market. So the regulator was necessary to make sure that independently it could put in place the necessary measures and rules to open up market for liberalization. So that is why the primary reason why the authority was set up. Throughout the years, 2 years later, 2002, actually 1 year later in 2002, we started regulating as well the electronic commerce market. 2003, we were entrusted with responsibility for postal sector regulation. Once again, the aim was to open up the sector towards more liberalization. And along the years, new functions were added to the authority. 2004, we were entrusted to manage spectrum radio management frequencies, which are an enabler to mobile technologies. And along the years, other functions were added. So 2010 date, we were given responsibilities to tackle some aspects related to digital divide, information, what we call the information society objectives, to try and much as possible to promote more digital skills and digital use by citizens. In 2014, we were one of the founding members of the eSkills Malta Foundation, foundation created to promote digital skills amongst citizens and amongst IT professionals. And later on, 2016, 2018, 2019, there were additional functions in terms of new digital remits that were being, digital regulation that was being created. Just to give you some examples, on electronic signatures, on requirements to put in place measures related to greater digital usage, like on geo-blocking, accessibility of online content when moving from one country to another. They were subject to new EU rules, and the authority was entrusted with responsibilities to enforce these rules at a national level. Of course, our remit was further extended very recently as well. First of all, COVID in 2020 hit us it hit everyone by surprise, and we realized more than any other time how essential digital technologies and communication technologies are to keep people connected on a personal level, on a social level, on a business level. In fact, the EU Commission at the time set up as well a special reporting mechanism to monitor how communication technologies were performing amongst in member states, because they were literally fundamental to keep everyone connected, and we're part of that mechanism to make sure and monitoring a stress test which happened on the local infrastructure, and thankfully things kept going and performing extremely well. And further to that, there is now even a greater influence and greater activity going on the policy side and on the regulatory side, even by the European Commission, by the newly set up von der Leyen Commission, which has placed digital as a key pillar in its agenda for the coming 5 years, to make sure that Europe remains on top in this field. So even the conference which we've organized was purposely focused to open up, to create further discussion and dialogue amongst regulators, industry, and various stakeholders to advance this agenda in Malta and, of course, in the EU as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. When you put it like that and you remind us how much has changed in 20 years, 20 years ago, we were all fighting for our internet connection against people in our families wanting to use the phone. It's no wonder that regulation has had to move on so much as well. So thank you for that walk down memory lane there, and also that great introduction to the MCA and your regulatory work. And Joseph, I'll come to you now. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how regulation has evolved over the past years in relation to all of the areas that fall under the MCA's remit.
Yeah, so as Robert was saying, we've been involved in this work since 2001 now, and probably the biggest change has come from the fact that at that point in time we were regulating, let's say, digital systems. But as time moved on, we're seeing a shift to regulating digital services rather than systems. So the telcos whom we have regulated for all these years are essentially based on completely digital systems nowadays. But it's how these systems are used and what is being sent and received through them that is becoming perhaps even more important than the systems themselves. Nowadays, there's a lot of potential for what can be termed to be high impact events online, So huge business transactions are occurring online all throughout the whole day, really. There's a lot of safety concerns that were not really so much in the limelight in the past years. Also, since the systems that were used to support our interaction online could not scale perhaps as they can scale these days to support different media, for example. Cybersecurity events or incidents that we have experienced over the past few years as well. These have all triggered regulators across the whole world really to look at these systems from a wider angle, not just as in the system that is providing the service, but the service itself. Now, the internet, as in the, let's call it the primary digital system, has changed the way we interact. We've seen the pandemic has put much further focus on how we use digital systems. It has made connectivity almost, I would dare to say, a life or death kind of requirement, as people who could not connect were immediately disadvantaged. So the model that has always been in use when it comes to regulation of the internet, what we refer to as the multi-stakeholder model, whereby no single entity has control over the whole internet itself, whilst it's still very important, because at the end of the day, it represents, let's say, a person's rights for freedom of speech, for example. But on the other hand, we're seeing that on its own, it is no longer adequate. So we're trying to see now, we're seeing a shift where we're getting into the actual services that are being delivered online and making sure that essentially there's this saying now that what is illegal offline should also be illegal online, for instance. That would be something that we're seeing regulation getting into as we move along. Of course, it's easier said than done. It's a very delicate balance here because, again, you do not want to stifle people's rights. But on the other hand, you want to introduce a level of responsibility for everyone who is on top of or using this medium.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph. That puts it all into context, doesn't it? And reminds us why regulation is so important. And Robert, I'll come back to you now. Perhaps you can explain a little bit more about the key developments and milestones that have been achieved partly by the sector, but also by the MCA in the last 2 decades.
Yes, thank you for this question, Joe. Let me first a bit go back. We're talking about regulation, and the role of us as regulators. And sometimes I find there's a little bit of misconception or lack of awareness about what a regulator is there to do or supposed to do. Normally I like using drawing a parallel with one of my favorite games of football. We're a bit like the referee. A very important role there to ensure that the rules of the game are observed. The rules of the game are set by the policymakers in this case. Being fair, being just, being motivated by of course, some of the objectives that in our case are ensuring competition, safeguarding the interest of end users, our spectators, drawing a parallel with a football game, but not taking a protagonist role. You have to leave the spectacle, the footballers, to the teams to perform, you know. We can't be in the limelight of things. And we're not like a kind of God that we can decide on who does what and dictate the game. So we're there, we must ensure we have to be hard when there needs to be hard, you know, show the red card when needed. But in respect, first of all, of the rules, and we have a further role in ensuring, we said about the rules of the game, we are being very active and having developed a lot of technical competence in the areas which we are entrusted with. We actually as well advise governments, and even at the European level, we work very closely with the Commission on how to further develop the rules so that they are appropriate and in line with the new challenges, with the new issues that come along as well with new technologies. So I think that is a bit of an important point to make about what our role is in this area. I mean, in terms of what coming back to your question, key developments and what we consider possibly key milestones, there's quite a lot, I mean, to mention that happened in the past 20 years. First of all, we were set up to open up markets for competition. And in a country like Malta, where the structure of the markets, it's a very small market, I think the fact that on, for example, services such as the internet, fixed broadband and mobile, we have 3 operators is an achievement in itself. I mean, it has helped to bring about new innovation. It has helped to lower prices. I remember 20 years ago, you had no choice, and prices it was very, very restricted in terms of basically take it or leave it on what was on offer. And other than that, as well, we have seen increased uptake by the market for new digital technologies. We're proud ourselves that we are one of the few countries, actually the only country in the European Union, to have gigabit connectivity nationwide, and 5G, which is considered as the latest in terms of mobile technologies, and 5G accessible nationwide amongst within the country. So these are targets that the European Commission has set for 2025, where Malta has already reached them. And in themselves, these technologies allow and enable other digital sectors to possibly flourish. So that is in itself is an enabler. Technology is an enabler for greater investments in other sectors. So when saying fintech and gaming, iGaming, these are all sectors that rely heavily on communication technologies. If I had to mention maybe a few as well examples of where the authority was very, very, very present and which are but always working behind the scenes, which have translated in some key benefits for the consumers. One of them is, for example, when Roam Like at Home was introduced, where mobile, the price for connecting, for making a call or using internet whilst roaming in a new country, which used to be exorbitant, the policymaker, the Commission, decided to take an initiative based on the intelligence information which was gathering from regulators and on the advice of regulators to remove these charges and set up maximum caps. And basically now we are in a position where we roam in EU member states whilst traveling, making use of our home package, not being charged any extra to that, which made a big difference, a substantial difference for everyone. Of course, we've seen developments and uptake of key technologies in terms of mobile subscriptions, of fixed subscriptions across the board, and even on e-commerce. We mentioned the e-commerce. So in terms of e-commerce, we run surveys to inform ourselves regularly, and we've seen that e-commerce uptake has been considerable over the years. In our last survey, 2020, a year ago, 58% of the Maltese are now are e-commerce users, compared to 26% when we last ran a survey in 2007. And probably once again, linking with what happened during the pandemic, if we are going to run a survey now, the uptake of e-commerce will be substantially greater.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to having a chat about e-commerce in a minute, because of course, such a huge and important part of what you do. But perhaps just before we jump into our chat about e-commerce, Joseph, I'll come to you. And thank you for that, Robert. Some very interesting reminders there about the work that's been done. A special thank you on the roaming front. That's definitely one that impacts on a daily basis almost. Joseph, the new regulatory instruments that are being put forward at a European level, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what that aims to tackle.
Yes, so I mean, the EU has been considering digital regulation for a number of years now, at least since 2001, when the MCA was established. We have been involved directly in the regulation of the e-commerce directive, as Robert has just mentioned. And that in itself was a very forward-looking directive, and keeping in mind the timeline that it was when it was introduced. At that point in time, the idea of e-commerce was still very much novel. You know, I mean, I seem to recall it's the time when PayPal came online, for example, and that was extremely novel at that point in time, because there was always a challenge related to payments, for instance. And a number of principles within the e-commerce directive itself have really stood the test of time very well. So, for example, the e-commerce directive discussed about the country of origin principle, for instance, whereby sellers were only bound to be regulated through the laws where they were established, for instance. That was something that helped seller confidence to open online storefronts. Or, for example, liability exemptions for hosting providers, whereby hosting providers were not liable for content that they did not put online themselves. You know, again, that was something that introduced further confidence into the marketplace. These are the same principles, really, or new principles that are coming in with newer regulations are typically based on these type of principles. Now, if you look, let's say, over the past 5 years, give or take, one could also even argue that the EU has become a world leader in digital regulation. Other regions are typically looking at the European Union to see how these are being implemented. Far-reaching regulations like, for example, the GDPR suddenly made everyone aware of their rights online. And various other regulations have come on board since then. I mean, if you start mentioning regulations on AI, on cybersecurity, on blockchain, cloud computing, all of these are being addressed one by one at an EU level, and then handled at the various member states by different authorities. All of them have one thing in common, really, which is essentially the protection of the individual in an online world. As we've seen, we're merging online and offline now. The realities between online and offline have pretty much become very, let's say, merged. So people are online at one point in time, then they are offline, and then they go online again later on during the day. From an MCA point of view, we've started with the e-commerce directive. Basically, at a high level, it aimed to remove obstacles from cross-border transactions within the European single market, whilst providing legal certainty for businesses and consumers. It's crucial, again, that you have confidence in the system. Otherwise, the system wouldn't catch up, wouldn't even start, really. Also, around 2000, there was also another noteworthy directive, which is the e-signatures directive, which again introduced an element of legal certainty to signed contracts online. Again, introducing further confidence into the system. This was then upgraded around 2015, in fact, through what we refer to as the eIDAS regulation. That also introduced then an element of eID. So people could now be identifiable in an online world as much as they are identifiable offline. Plus a host of what we refer to as trust services like electronic signatures and electronic seals that make the online environment more trustworthy, so to speak. Robert mentioned a bit the geo-blocking regulation. That is another regulation that has come about relatively recently, I believe around 2018, that made it possible for people to purchase products from anywhere in the EU. So, for instance, a seller could not redirect you to an alternate web page based on your country of residence, so to speak, which was standard practice back in the day. Other regulations, again, the cross-border content regulation, for instance, that ensures that whatever content you purchased in your residence, in your country of residence, is also usable when you travel across the whole EU. Over the past couple of years as well, we've been implementing the Web Accessibility Directive. I believe we'll have some time to talk specifically on this, but in a nutshell, it ensures that websites and now also mobile apps of the public sector are accessible to everyone, irrespectively of any disability one may have. And this brings us to today's Digital Services Act, which is essentially a package of a number of regulations, one of them being the Digital Service Act itself, which is still being drafted and negotiated. But in short, it is focused mostly on these large platforms that everyone uses these days, and which have what we refer to as a network effect and a gatekeeper role for sellers and buyers and citizens, really. And it aims to introduce a level of responsibility in the way these platforms conduct their business. So again, most of the let's say reasons behind all these digital instruments is to introduce a safer environment, a more responsible environment from the supplier side into the online world.
Thank you, Joseph. Again, great insight there. And Bernard, I'll come to you now because I'd love to hear a little bit about e-commerce. And let's dive in and talk. I mean, Robert gave us a bit of insight there about the incredible numbers of users when it comes to e-commerce in Malta, but perhaps you can talk to us about how widespread it really is.
Okay, so perhaps building on what Joseph has said before and Robert, indeed, we've seen a lot happening in the past 20 years. And we expect to see a lot at the current state, a lot of flux in the scene of e-commerce and everything. As rightly said, COVID has accelerated everything, and we've seen a big spike in not just activity, but in the form of e-commerce activity. So just to set a bit of the discussion, so far we have spoken a lot about regulations. Now maybe we speak a bit from the business side, tangibly what these regulations and the dynamics of the market reflect into. Defining e-commerce in itself is very difficult. It gets always more difficult. So we have it defined in the regulations, etc. But ultimately, when we look today at what we, even doing the surveys, what we measure when we say e-commerce, it gets tough. Like in history, we used to talk about shoes, books, etc., etc. Now we're talking about events, digital content, and even the consumer, like Robert mentioned, 58%. Probably, if we had, probably consumers don't know they're doing e-commerce. Everyone buying an airline ticket is doing e-commerce. Anyone buying food from takeaways delivered by a courier is e-commerce. So it's pervasive everywhere, and the numbers are growing very fast. What we're seeing is that certainty is becoming very, very important for the business, because there are so many dimensions. So obviously there are the parts which we are responsible for, like Joseph was saying, the platform regulations and online related regulations. But then there are others like the GDPR, taxation, there is logistics related. There are so many aspects, regulatory aspects, that businesses going online need to understand every element of them and adhere to each one of them. And that's where we see, so this is where we see ourselves, and together with other entities coming in and helping out create this more certainty going forward. The other thing I want to mention, building on what Joe was mentioning, that historically we've been looking at helping business go online, and that was our objective. So when we'll find the laggards, let's say the laggards, those that have resisted technology so far, and we help them go online. But that's no longer good enough. So many businesses are already online. However, this going online is a state where you need to continuously optimize, improve on your infrastructure, on your operations, and it's a continuous cycle of learning, improving, and building your business model for competition and remaining relevant to the consumer and the respective market. And what we want to do going forward, us and with other partners, is to ensure that businesses that go online, they just don't do it for the sake of being there, but as part of this ongoing process.
And in fact, Bernard, perhaps you can tell us a little more about the barriers that there are for businesses going online to do e-commerce activities. I mean, has that improved in recent years, or are we still sort of seeing that certain businesses are holding back?
Okay, so historically, the traditional barriers would have been accessibility and skills. So they haven't been eradicated as such, but they are no longer the main reason why businesses don't go online. What we think is from the consumer side, there's a lot of demand. However, some businesses have been doing very well historically and haven't felt the need to switch so far. They have some inertia and so far haven't felt that need to jump on. They might be fine, they might continue like that, but they might be facing a bit of quite some challenge. We have a group of businesses who are born digital, who are the startup-ish sort of business who come online, and basically there is a lot of incentives nowadays to help them out. Obviously, they run some risk, but they tend to disrupt the other guys. But they are, we've seen them mushrooming here and there, and there are quite some good propositions. And obviously, there are the businesses who have been doing e-commerce, and they are evolving, and they keep investing into their business. And those guys, there are many incentives and opportunities for learning and financial fiscal assistance as well. From a business side, as barriers per se, they have come down a lot. Like even if you look at the supply side, the peripheral service provision, being it infrastructure, being payments, being legal advice, there is a lot. What we think could improve is access to better understanding of what opportunities are out there. Businesses tend to find a partner and stick to the partner, and they don't shop around enough. They might have the optimum solution in place, but too often, unless you discover how others are addressing their business problems and how they could improve by, they tend to get stuck in a limiting structure, often not too efficient and effective.
Yeah, I can totally see that, Bernard. Very good insight there, and a good call to action for the business people watching today to sort of consider the various options that there are. Let's shift focus momentarily now, Robert, and come to you to discuss the conference that was organized last week, and the European Commission, as well as other international speakers, they all complimented the MCA for your contribution to international fora. Robert, maybe you can briefly tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, it's true. I mean, Roberto Viola, who's Director General of DG Connect, responsible for connectivity, actually complimented us on the work done. Just to put you in the picture, first of all, the MCA, as I referred to earlier, was born in 2001 out of the need for member states to create, according to EU rules, an independent national regulatory authorities. there are structures in place, there are agencies in place set up by EU rules in which we are required to participate. Basically, EU rules need to be implemented in a harmonized way across all member states, and most of the times the legislator, they put the rules on a more of a principle-based nature. Then it's up to the regulators, to the technical people, to iron out the actual implementation and how that could be done in an effective way in all member states. So a lot of work goes on after EU laws are enacted on actually how these are to be put in place and monitored, because as with any policy and any rule, you have to make sure that you have a loop where you literally look at whether the regulation is reaching the desired outcomes, so that if maybe some outcomes need to be adjusted, the new rules could be amended. Now, from our side, we've been participating in international and European Union fora since we were set up, especially within the European Union. We take part in a number of agencies and groups within the postal and electronic communications sector and the e-commerce sector, more specifically, as well as within international organizations, particularly under the United Nations. So we're talking about organizations like the International Telecommunications Union, the Universal Postal Union, which basically lay out the global rules about how telcos and postal matters are to be dealt with at a global level. So just to give you an example, I've mentioned earlier that mobile technologies make use of radio frequencies which rely on management of spectrum. Which frequencies are to be used for what purposes are designated at an international level with the participation of all countries in the world. So whether a frequency is to be used for military purpose, for civil purpose, for commercial use purpose, those are decisions taken at the international level, which the MCA, being the technical expert in this area, having built technical competence in this area, represents Malta in these matters. Just as, because sometimes numbers speak for themselves, MCA were around 62 people, if I'm not mistaken, as a complement. We have 10% of our staff, so more than 6 people actually leading, co-chairing important groups within these fora. It's something which we've consciously decided over the past years to invest heavily and trying to take a much more of a proactive and leading role within these structures. So, for example, within the Electronic Communications Agency, BEREC, we have for the first time our head, Jasmine Boujeya, who is vice chairing this agency. And we have another 2 people who are coordinating important working groups, which do a lot of the work. And we are, together with Germany and France, the only national regulatory authority having literally 3 people leading important structures within this agency. It was a conscious decision taken by the authority, knowing that a lot of the policy making and which is happening at the European level is mainly being inspired by these agencies. So we want to be active players rather than sitting back and then having to follow what's being decided, but we want to be active players in helping out in the formulation of the new rules.
It's certainly very exciting, Robert. Thank you for that insight there. And Joseph, now you spoke a little bit earlier about digital inclusion, and off the back of sort of what we've been talking about, perhaps you can, it's a very important part of what you do. Perhaps you can tell us a little more about it.
Yes, just some background really on this topic. As you know, we're spending more time online these days. In general, or on average, we spend around 2.5 hours per day on social media. This was brought about mostly due to the mobile devices, because in the past one had to sit at a desk and consume data through a laptop or a desktop device. But nowadays, it's so easy to just go online and then disconnect and then reconnect again. So for sure, there is a need to ensure that everyone can tap into this online world, and digital inclusion essentially comprises all the initiatives one can take to ensure what we refer to as universal access to digital for all. If you consider, for instance, the US, around 26% of all adults have some sort of disability. So if we do not cater for digital inclusion, we're essentially having a quarter of the population missing out. So that's also a quarter of the market that business or organizations are losing. So digital inclusion really is beneficial both for the citizen, but also for business organizations at the end of the day. So when we talk about digital inclusion, we refer to the two facilities that help make sure that the consumption of digital content is accessible for all, or at least it's accessible to as wide an audience as possible. A few examples, and this is not rocket science really, would be, for instance, using the correct color contrast on a mobile app. For instance, you avoid using white text on gray backgrounds, which seems to be a very popular implementation these days, unfortunately. Or say you want to ensure that your website can be used both through a normal mouse interface, but also through a keyboard, for instance. So you make it available for as wide an audience as possible. These are just a few examples, really, when it comes to inclusion. Let's say inclusion attempts to make sure that your content is available for all. Since 2018, the MCA has started working on the Web Accessibility Directive. The aim of this directive is focused on the public sector, and it aims to ensure that over time, because this is not really something that can happen, from overnight. I mean, there's quite a lot of work involved to make sure that websites and now also mobile apps are accessible to all. But we're working towards a reality whereby all public sector websites and mobile apps are compliant. And by compliant, I mean that they follow particular web accessibility guidelines to widen again the audience as much as possible. By the end of this year, we would have assessed almost 200 websites, in fact, from an accessibility perspective, of course. And we have also started recently, since last July, in fact, also assessing government mobile apps. We've already started seeing a number of improvements in the public sector when it comes to accessibility. So, for instance, if you go on our website, for example, you should be able to navigate it using a keyboard besides a mouse, or using a screen reader for visually impaired persons. We're also checking websites, public sector websites, to make sure that they have a very clear and defined accessibility statement, which states what the accessibility posture of the website or the app is, and who someone may contact with regards accessibility issues. I have to say, government has invested quite heavily in this over the past few years, both from the work that is involved to render these websites that were already in place compliant. And I trust we'll see further improvements in this area for the benefit of everyone, really.
That's brilliant, Joseph. And of course, like you say, it makes huge consumer sense, very important for the consumer, but also very important for businesses as well to be on board and to understand both the importance and the benefits.
Exactly.
And so to wrap up our conversation today, staying on the business front, Bernard, I'm going to come to you. Perhaps you can tell us what the MCA is planning from an e-commerce perspective to boost take-up. So for anybody watching today that's thinking, yes, I want to make the most of this, I'm inspired by this conversation, I'm excited to take my business forward from a digital and e-commerce perspective, what can they look to the MCA for to help in the next year or so?
Okay, so the old work plan is coming to a close now, and we're planning for the next 3 years, which will coincide with the government's ICT strategy. So at the moment, we're doing some consultations and planning ahead. What we're seeing is a three-stream work plan. On one front, it's the building the regulatory framework, which Joseph has mentioned a lot about, and built on that, we will continue to do our monitoring and intelligence building, because that feeds into both our policy formulation, but also to the business, because it's good intelligence for anyone going into the local market. And we will also further build the e-commerce forum, which is our consultation body with the operators and the stakeholders in e-commerce, to allow us to feed in direction how to best sharpen our policies, as well as to share with them developments. The second pillar, which is most directly directed to the sellers and the businesses out there, is the capacity building efforts. We will continue to collaborate with education institutions to offer more education and awareness opportunities. We have the eBusinessify. We'll continue to build on that, and we'll see both entrepreneurial and technical skills developing in the respective entities. We will also look at evolving a very in-depth guides for all the different aspects of regulatory compliance. There are, as I mentioned, it's a maze for many of them. It can be overwhelming. We want to make it very simple and accessible to everyone in a way that anyone wanting to go and can feel some form of comfort. And we're looking at also giving some assistance over there in terms of support, expert support in adherence. As well, we are looking at creating opportunities to gain exposure to technological and business solutions. And it could be through events or publications, or we'll see how that evolves. But as I mentioned, this is one very important aspect. The final and third front from our end will be the demand acceleration. So we're looking at encouraging local consumers to buy more from local sources. Not to. The aim is we see a lot of local to local B2C and B2B transactions, which if transferred to e-commerce would generate a lot of value for all the parties involved, and we see a lot of opportunities there. And finally, smarter e-commerce use education for the consumers. We know the realities right now. It's important to always have smart consumers.
Thank you, Bernard. That's very exciting and a great update there. And I'm sure lots of viewers looking forward to being able to interact with the MCA and hopefully increase their digital participation and their e-commerce participation as well. Congratulations to the MCA for 20 years and for a very successful conference last week. And thank you to all three of you gentlemen for being with me on the boardroom and giving such great insight to our audience today. And thank you, as always, to those of you watching, whether you're at home or in the office. This has been another episode of The Boardroom. You've been live with us on Facebook. If you didn't manage to catch this live, then you'll be able to watch it on who'swho.mt, Malta's leading business platform. Thanks for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you on a future episode of The Boardroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.